The Forest of Time. A Temporal Protection Corps story. By E. W. Barnes. Digital voice narration. For A.B. with Love. Chapter 1. Tanima closed the first airlock door, triggering the atmospheric equalization system. One-way vents removed the air, and soon the sound of her breathing in her biosuit was all she could hear. The only sense of movement were the vibrations felt in her feet. A wall screen to her left flashed. Vacuum cycle complete. All indicators are green. We may proceed, she said. Sean keyed in the code to open an airtight cabinet and pulled out a standard research kit. Ready, he said, his voice crackling in her earpiece. After you, Dr. Nilsson. Thank you, Dr. Lamond, she answered with a grin. After working together day and night for 3 weeks, using their formal titles was a joke now. Tanima double-checked the readings on the wall screen before opening the outer door. Afternoon sunlight flooded in, dappled golden and green by the gentle waving of leaves caught in a breeze. Tanima laughed as Shang took a deep breath, even though he only inhaled the air he carried in his biosuit. You always do that, she chuckled. He shrugged as he stepped out. I can imagine the fresh air, even if I can't breathe it, he answered, unruffled by her teasing. He followed her as she led the way through the underbrush. They stepped around rough cycad trunks and clumps of horsetail. Decaying ginkgo leaves on the forest floor softened their tread. The suit's external sensors broadcast a rustling sound off to their right. Aomaya, Shang grunted as they spotted a small mammal darting under ferns next to a large stone. Tanima nodded, not surprised. The mouse-like Eomaya were omnipresent in the daylight, disappearing into shallow burrows when the sun went down. Minutes later, they reached their destination. Zhang's goal was a rough nest scraped together from dried conifer branches and grasses, lined with feathers colored red, brown, yellow, and black. Inside was a treasure trove of glistening eggs the size of their fists, left for the moment, unguarded. Mom will be back soon, Tanima said, glancing at the lake, which served as a waterhole for the local wildlife. We should get started. Shang nodded. He broke the decontamination seal on the research kit and bent over the nest, careful not to touch the edges as he waved a scanner over the eggs, recording the size and weight of each. The data flashed across the heads-up display screen in his biosuit before being transmitted to the computers in the base. Tanima turned away from the nest to scan a medium-sized cycad, clustered horsetail grasses at its feet. Tanima recorded temperature readings at multiple levels from the forest floor to 2 meters above the ground, before starting a deep scan of the cycad, up the trunk and across each frond. They're growing well, Shang commented. They're a full 10% larger today, and I'm seeing movement. Already. With her back still to Shang and the nest, Tanima toggled her heads-up display to access the scanner feed. The babies twitched in their confined space, red flutters on the black screen. It appears their gestation is shorter than you expected, Tanima said. Perhaps so, Shang agreed. This supports your theory that the gelatinous layer transfers nutrients, Tanima added, as she continued taking readings of the cycad. Like albumin, except secreted by the mother instead of contained inside the shells. The image of the embryos vanished, replaced by a small square of static. The biosuit video feed had cut out. She reset the software and made a note to check it when they returned to the base. Her display registered movement at the mineral lake nearby. Mom's coming back, we have to get out of here, she whispered, even though she could not be heard outside of the biosuit communication system. One more second, Shang muttered. One more second for what? Tanima was going to ask when she turned back to face him, but Shang was holding out his hand to take Tanima's scanner, his data gathering completed, so she said nothing. He put the scanner inside the kit and secured it closed. Shang led the way as they followed the homing beacon back to the blind that hid their laboratory facility. The airlock was concealed behind a holographic projection, a perfect reflection of the surrounding environment, and without the beacon, it would be almost impossible to find by sight alone. Shang stepped around a projected conifer trunk, entering the airlock with Tanima right behind. Tanima closed the door and initiated the cycle. The external vents opened as the system evacuated the indigenous air, before sealing closed. For a few moments Tanima and Shang waited in a complete vacuum, relying solely on their biosuits as the system bathed them in UV. When the indicators flashed green, Tanima checked the screens. "Atmosphere removal and UV wash are completed," she read aloud. "We can repressurize." The vents opened, filling the airlock with oxygen transported from 125 million years in the future. Tanima released the closure on her biosuit. There was a hiss and her ears popped. She pulled the helmet from her head and took a deep breath. After 30 minutes of breathing recycled air in the biosuit, the cool air of the research facility was refreshing. Shang had already shed his biosuit. While Tanima was still unzipping her suit, he moved into the UV decontamination chamber, closing his eyes as the system scanned him for contaminants and microbes, including bacteria and viruses. Shang heaved a sigh of relief when he received an all-clear signal. "I'm going to the lab," he said as Tanima completed her UV scan. "I'd like to analyze this latest data as soon as possible." "You go ahead. I'm going to eat first," Tanima called back as she headed for the kitchen. Yi-Jan base had been constructed from prefabricated components, formed in the shape of a six-sided star, with the laboratory wing across from the airlock, the physical recreation area across from the sleeping quarters, and the kitchen across from the computer room. Temporal Protection Corps engineers had created each component in a clean room and UV washed them before transporting them through time. Tanima activated the heads-up monitor in the kitchen and entered a command to sync up the data collected from their latest excursion. She was still reading it over a plate of reconstituted pasta with cream sauce when Shang called her on the intercom. "Tanima, have you got a moment?" "Be there in 5, Tanima responded. "I've been going over the data," Shang began as she entered the lab. "I need a sample of that gel on the eggs." "What have you found?" "The rate of growth is greater than I estimated. The gel may be the key." He showed her the data analysis. "I admit this is very exciting," Tanima said. "But this is well outside the scope of your assignment. Further research on these hypotheses requires authorization." He stared at her, and Tanima almost took a step back. There was a strange look on his face. Then he blinked and looked like himself again. "You're right," he said. "I need to do this properly. Will you help me with the authorization documents?" "Of course," Tanima smiled with relief, though she wasn't sure why. It took several hours to complete the extensive documentation required to request authorization for the new parameters he wanted to explore. By the time he transmitted the request for approval, it was dark outside. Tanima yawned. "I'm exhausted. I need some sleep." "I'm going to wait here in case there are questions about our request," Shang said, watching the computer screen. "I want to answer them right away." "It can wait until morning, you know," she reminded him with a laugh. "The temporal amplifier can send our responses through time, so they get our answers right after they sent their questions." "I know," he said. "But time will have passed here. I want to get started as soon as we receive approval." "Okay, good night," she said, yawning again. "See you in the morning." Shang waved a hand in response, not looking up from the screen as she left the room. Tanima woke sluggishly, consciousness coming slowly. There was a noise, a loud blaring demanding her attention, insisting that she wake. She sat up. Her head felt heavy. "What's going on?" she asked herself. The facility's quarantine alarm was going off. She leapt up, running, following the sound to the airlock. The airlock doors stood wide open. A sweet, loamy smell washed over her as she stood gaping. Spores, bacteria, even Cretaceous period viruses flowed across her into the facility, while their mutated descendants from 125 million years in the future escaped into the biosphere. Why hadn't the lockdown system sealed the breach? With a grunt that was almost a sob, she closed the airlock door to the base. She stopped Cretaceous air from entering the research facility, but there was nothing she could do about the air from the future which escaped outside. She put her head in her hands and then looked up. Where was Shang? He hadn't responded to the alarm. Shang, she called out. There was no answer. Shang, she shouted as she ran through the facility. His bed looked as if he had not slept in it. He wasn't in the kitchen, the recreation area, or the computer room. In disbelief, she returned to the airlock. Zhang's biosuit was in its alcove next to the door. She forced her mind to accept what she did not want to believe. Shang had breached quarantine. This was a disaster. She took a deep breath, trying not to cry, and returned to the computer room. Her hand trembled as she tapped the computer screen. This is Dr. Tanima Nilsson, she started in a shaky voice. I have enacted emergency temporal stabilization protocols. I request immediate decontamination assistance and extraction. I repeat, requesting immediate decontamination assistance and extraction. Chapter 2. I'll never figure this out. Yes, you will. Just slow down and look at it from different angles. Temporal Protection Corps Commander Rose Sprucewood smiled encouragingly at fellow agent Richard Kern. They were sitting in the main atrium of Temporal Protection Corps headquarters, a large area anchored in the center by a fountain surrounded by windows opening to the park-like grounds and lit with mid-morning sun by huge skylights overhead. Rose and Richard sat at a table by the atrium cafe, the fronds of a potted palm obscuring them from the view of passers-by, which gave the table a cozy feeling in the large space. With a sigh, Richard read again the paper in front of him. Such an archaic way to communicate, he thought, as he squinted his eyes at the single sheet. Dogs are cutest when they are sleeping. Orange towers glow at sunset. Nibble the cheese, don't gulp it. Triangles fall into 3 categories. Forests line the slope of the hill. Often is how much we eat. Regardless, the poem is lovely. Greater than this is love. Evening is my favorite time. Trade and use tools for new ones. Twins are not common in my family. Hair is different from fur. Entertainment is pleasant for almost everyone. Pansies are colorful in the snow. A is the first letter of the alphabet. Running faster got him there more quickly. Trust your instincts. Yellow sunflowers dotted the meadow. He shook his head. I don't know what it means. Is it about your getting married? He asked with a wink. What makes you say that? Rose cocked her head at him. The reference to love, dogs, poems, twins, it sounds very domestic, he trailed off with a shrug. She chuckled. My fiancé, Kevin, is not that domestic. Come on, you're trying too hard. The solution is simpler than trying to figure out how the sentences are connected. Too simple for me, Your Majesty, Richard said, handing the paper back to her. I give up. The solution is here. Rose held up the sheet and pointed to the capital letters at the start of each sentence. Richard scanned the letters and then exhaled with a smile. Don't forget the party, he read out loud, chuckling. You're right, it was simple. My favorite kinds of codes are the ones that are deceptively simple. Rose smiled as she folded the paper and watched him expectantly. What? He asked. Are you going to the party? He took a sip of coffee. I don't know. It seems like all we've been doing lately is go to retirement parties. This one will be the hardest of all, I think. Second hardest, he added in a mutter. Excuse me, a young man interrupted. Director Jeffries requests you report to his office. Both of you, he added as Richard opened his mouth to beg off. Thank you, Jonas. Rose stood and cleared away the remains of her coffee. Rose and Richard made their way to the staircase at the back of the atrium, which led to TPC offices on the second floor. Rose paused in the director's doorway, and Richard, who had been smiling at a woman walking past, nearly ran into her. Agent Astrid Berg, head of Temporal Protection Corps security, was already in one of 3 chairs in front of the director's desk. The director sat with hands clasped in front of him, resting his chin on his index fingers. Hello, Richard said, his voice fading as he trailed into the office behind Rose. Director Jeffries' office had windows overlooking the atrium and out to the grounds, and if one picked the right chair and angled it just so, you could enjoy the view while still paying attention to the director. Now selecting the chair with the view meant looking directly at Agent Berg. As Rose chose the chair next to Agent Berg, Richard had no choice but to sit across from her. Well into her 8th decade, Agent Berg's steely eyes were still piercing, and she raised her eyebrows as if she knew what he was thinking. Director Jeffries cleared his throat. Thank you for coming so promptly, he said. A matter has arisen that requires immediate action and discretion, he added with a pointed look at Agent Berg. Richard furrowed his brows. Rose inhaled and leaned forward. How can we help, Director? She asked. We received an emergency transmission, a request for extraction from one of our paleobiologists, Director Jeffries began. Paleo as in prehistoric? Richard asked. Precisely, the director said, as he rested his hands on the desk. Dr. Tanima Nilsson is one of 2 scientists doing research in the early Cretaceous period at the Yi-Jan Formation. We received an emergency message from her informing us that her colleague, Dr. Lamond, somehow left the base, causing a quarantine breach and contaminating the biosphere. How did it happen? Rose asked. We're not sure. Dr. Nilsson woke to find Dr. Lamond missing and the facility exposed to the indigenous environment. Why are you telling us this? Richard asked. We need you to join Dr. Nilsson to assess the situation, Director Jeffries began. But why us? Richard interrupted. We're not scientists, and neither of us are certified for paleo shifting. There must be someone with proper training you can assign to this mission. What do you mean by assess the situation? Rose was less alarmed at traveling to the Cretaceous period than Richard. You've consulted the temporal mainframe, right? You should already know if the quarantine breach impacted the timeline. She paused, her eyes shifting between Director Jeffries and Agent Berg. We haven't consulted the mainframe, as you've already guessed, Agent Berg said. And that's why you're here, Rose nodded to Agent Berg. Even if the timeline was impacted, it would not be a matter for TPC security unless you suspected a threat. We believe there may be more going on here than an accidental quarantine breach 125 million years ago, the director said softly. What do you mean? Richard asked. Shortly after we received the emergency message from Dr. Nilsson, my department discovered an unusual increase in temporal mainframe activity, Agent Berg answered. Several timeline analyses were initiated, some focused on 125 million years ago, and some on the year 2127. But we could not trace the source of the requests. They appear to have originated from a temporal mainframe interface outside of the TPC. What information was requested? Rose frowned. We don't know, Director Jeffries admitted. The requests were encrypted, and we haven't been able to decode them. I thought that was impossible, Richard frowned. The temporal mainframe database uses quantum computing to analyze information across timelines. There should be no code it can't decipher. And yet there is, Agent Berg responded. We don't know whether the unauthorized temporal mainframe requests originated from within the TPC or from without, Director Jeffries said, his eyes focused on the desk in front of him. It could be nothing, an authorized TPC request from another time frame that's been temporarily compartmentalized, for example. It's happened before. But because you don't know who to trust at the moment and who to send to the Cretaceous, Rose said. Actually, we do, Agent Berg said as she shared a smile with Director Jeffries, who was nodding at Rose and Richard. But we don't know anything about the Cretaceous period. Rose is a 20th century expert. My area is the 19th century. We're not qualified, Richard objected. We can't wait until we've vetted all TPC agents and staff. We need to get someone on site as soon as possible, the director said. Requests for information regarding 125 million years ago could be related to this incident, but what's the significance of 2127? Rose asked thoughtfully. Agent Berg glanced at Director Jeffries before answering. It may be a coincidence, but as of now, the only event out of the ordinary in 2127 is the founding of the Chestnut Coven. The Chestnut Coven, Richard exclaimed. That fringe group no one takes seriously? The same, Director Jeffries answered. But now you're taking the Chestnut Coven seriously. What's changed? Rose asked, her eyebrows raised. We didn't say we're taking them seriously. All we said is that the Chestnut Coven founding is the only event that stands out in 2127, the director shrugged. Just keep your eyes open, Agent Berg added. That's all we're saying. Richard opened his mouth to speak again, but Rose rested a hand on his arm. He closed his mouth with a snap. What are our orders? Rose asked. The mission is straightforward. Find Dr. Lamond, assist Dr. Nilsson with the decontamination procedures, and assess damage to the timeline. I expect you will be back in time to enjoy Agent Berg's retirement party. The director glanced at Agent Berg with a gloomy expression. I will prepare you for this mission and provide you with all the background information you need. You are to discuss this mission with no one except the director and myself, Agent Berg added. What if Dr. Lamond is dead or can't be found? Rose asked. Director Jeffries' brow tightened. We're operating on the assumption that he's alive and can be found, he said. If Dr. Lamond is dead, it will be a tragic loss for the TPC. In that case, we'll send a team to retrieve his body. And if we discover they have damaged the timeline... There was a long pause. The room seemed to grow cold. Then you will follow the required protocols, Director Jeffries answered. Chapter 3. Branches whipped his face and arms as he ran. He felt blood dripping down his cheek and into his mouth. He swallowed convulsively, but the metallic taste didn't quench his thirst. The blood itched, but he could not stop to clean it up. He had to keep running. He lost his footing. Wobbling and waving his arms, he worked to stay upright. He put his hand on a tree trunk to steady himself and took deep breaths as he inspected his shoe. He had stepped in dung still warm. He wrinkled his nose, grateful the droppings were from an herbivore. Predator droppings smelled much worse. He lifted his foot to scrape the dung from his shoe when the tree trunk next to him moved away. Not a tree. Ulterinus, he gasped as he staggered away from the dinosaur which had just dropped the steaming pile. He stumbled as he turned, breathing raggedly. He had to keep running. His head collided with the branch of a tree, a real tree this time, and he fell hard to the forest floor. Stars flickered through fanning ginkgo leaves as his sight faded to blackness. Rose and Richard followed Agent Berg to an empty room at the far end of a corridor that stretched away from the atrium. The agent hall housed the temporal amplifiers used by TPC agents and chronohistorians on assignment. Unlike the training hall on the other side of the building, which was lit by large windows facing the grounds, The agent hall was illuminated by screens on the doors lining the corridor. Most displayed the green of an available temporal amplifier. A few glowed blue, showing the temporal amplifier was in use. A shift back this far in time can be difficult, Agent Berg said, after she closed the door. Some report disorientation and confusion, which can last from a few minutes to a few hours. It's temporary and will pass. Rose and Richard nodded in unison. I assume you have not used a biosuit before? Agent Berg asked. Richard shook his head and Rose answered no at the same time. They are easy to use, and Dr. Nilsson can assist you if you have questions. You'll make the shift in the biosuits, and on arrival you will follow Dr. Nilsson's directions to decontaminate the laboratory facility. Only when she authorizes it can you remove your biosuits. Understood? They nodded. Agent Berg opened a tall cabinet and pulled out 2 dull gray suits, similar in design to spacesuits, but less bulky and more streamlined. You must wear a biosuit when you leave the facility. These have already been calibrated for the signal from the base's homing beacon. When you search for Dr. Lamond, you will carry his suit, and once you locate him, he must be suited up before you bring him back. She smiled as they exchanged glances, her piercing eyes twinkling. I know. The horse is already out of the barn, as the saying goes, but that's the protocol. Please follow it. Is there any suggestion of a personal conflict or rift between the scientists? Rose asked. No, Agent Berg answered. According to the Sciences Department, they are respected colleagues and work well together. There's no evidence of unusual behavior by either of them. She handed them each a tablet computer. All information related to Dr. Nilsson and Dr. Lamond's research projects has been classified. For the duration of your mission, you have clearance to review any materials you need. You'll want to focus on the initial research proposals, Dr. Lamond's request for authorization to broaden his research parameters, and Dr. Nilsson's emergency message. It looks like the request for authorization was submitted less than 24 hours local time after Dr. Lamond disappeared and Dr. Nilsson declared an emergency, Rose said as she scanned the tablet screen. That's correct, Agent Berg said, as she moved to the desk in the center of the room which housed the temporal amplifier console. Do you think they're connected? Richard looked up from his tablet. That's a good question, Agent Kern. I look forward to learning the answer when you return, Agent Berg responded as she tapped the temporal amplifier screen. I have programmed the shift coordinates. When you're ready, you may activate the temporal amplifier. Questions? No. I'll leave you to prepare then, and good luck. See you at your retirement party, Richard said. Agent Berg paused, then smiled and nodded as she left the room. These guys messed up, Rose said after the door clicked closed. Yeah, they did, Richard said. Leaving the facility exposed to who knows what kind of bacteria and viruses. That's not what I meant, Rose said, holding up the tablet. Take a look at the request for authorization to expand the research. Richard tapped his tablet and started reading. He was studying the reproduction of Cyno, Netho, he muttered. Sinornithosaurus, Rose offered. It's a small feathered dinosaur, about a meter tall. Richard ignored the interruption and continued reading. Find new medicines, a new energy source, establish base near nesting area, gather photosynthesis data, daily observation of mother's behavior, position, size, temperature, he read aloud. Oh, here it is. Analyze the gel secreted by mother for unusual characteristics. Do you see it? Rose asked. See what? Read between the lines, Rose said with a smirk. That's your skill, not mine, Richard said, rolling his eyes. What do you see? The original research parameters were explicit that the eggs would not be touched, and specifically laid out the steps they would take to evaluate the eggs. No step was missed. The follow-up, however, only requested authorization to test the gel on the eggs. Yeah, and? Richard said, as he pulled the biosuit up to his waist. It says nothing about collecting the sample, she said. I think they already collected a sample without authorization. Maybe they just forgot that part. Richard began. Unlikely, Rose responded. Do you think the emergency request is false? Richard asked, his brow furrowed. No, Rose said. But I think it's possible there's more going on here than we've been told. Richard scoffed. What? Like a conspiracy? Like the Chestnut Coven is behind it? More like overambitious scientists, Rose snorted and then cocked her head at him. The director talking about the Chestnut Coven bothered you, didn't it? She watched him with a piercing expression, looking uncomfortably like Agent Berg. No, not at all, his voice wavered a little. He cleared his throat and gave her a sheepish smile. Okay, yeah, a little. It's just that after all we went through as a society, when time travel was discovered, all we sacrificed to come together as a world, I really hate that there are people fighting what we all decided together. Everyone's free to have an opinion, Rose said. Yeah, but if we're supposed to keep our eyes open on this mission, then we're not talking about just expressing opinions anymore, are we? Rose frowned. No, I guess we're not. There was a long silence, broken only by a swishing sound, as Richard put his arms into the biosuit and secured the closure. Rose stood. With efficient movements, she put on her biosuit and picked up the helmet. Richard recognized the set of her shoulders, the movements made with knife-like precision. He'd seen it before. He knew what she would say next. We do this by the book, she said, not seeing Richard mouth the words as she spoke them. Every step we take will be in accordance with TPC policy and protocols. Are we agreed? Yes, ma'am, he said, only partially joking. For all his teasing, he deeply respected Rose Sprucewood, and there was no other TPC agent he'd rather have watching his back. But he would not tell her that. Stage 2 decontamination complete. Proceeding to Stage 3. Tanima found the digitized male voice of the computer comforting. The system followed its program without deviation. There were no surprises, no divergence from set parameters. Its stability anchored her. She tapped the screen, giving the go-ahead to start the second stage. Her hands no longer shook, but her mind raced. 3 hours had passed since she'd sent the emergency message. The only reply she'd received was that the TPC was sending someone to assist. She'd expected numerous questions from the head of the TPC Sciences Department, followed by a team of scientists to assist her. The terse response followed by silence was unnerving. When she wasn't monitoring the decontamination program, she watched the screens displaying the live feed from the exterior of the base. There was still no sign of Shang. She smacked her hand on the desk in frustration. How could this have gone so wrong? She hoped they could find Shang, that he was alive and unharmed. She prayed the timeline would be unaffected. But even if he was fine, even if the breach hadn't messed up the future, their careers were over. They could never again conduct research on site. They would be relegated to analyzing others' finds, reviewing others' conclusions. And if Shang was dead? Incoming shift, the temporal amplifier's computer voice announced. She took a step back and took a steadying breath. The air rippled like a mirage, glowing the strong red of a shift far back in time. 2 figures in biosuits appeared before her. Then the silence was shattered. The quarantine breach alarm went off again, as red warnings flashed on the computer screen. Chapter 4. Contamination detected, the computer voice repeated, no longer sounding calm, though the voice hadn't changed its intonation. Tanima flinched. This was the 3rd time the sweep had revealed indigenous microbial permeation. Dr. Nilsson, a woman's voice asked through her earpiece. Yes, just a moment, Tanima shouted, as she tapped the computer screen to start a base-wide UV flush. Hold still, she directed as she closed her eyes. There was a hum, and she imagined she could feel the wave of UV light wash over her. There was a long tone from the computer, and she opened her eyes. Tanima keyed her microphone. Welcome to Yijan Base. She pronounced it Yijan. I'm Dr. Nilsson. I'm Agent Rose Sprucewood. This is Agent Richard Kern. We're here to assist with your emergency decontamination and extraction request. Agents. Tanima had expected TPC scientists, people trained for this kind of mission, who understood the protocols and dangers of operating in the prehistoric. Why had the TPC sent agents instead? Is there someplace I can sit down? The man Agent Kern asked as he swayed a little. Tanima shook off her dismay. Here, she answered as offered him her chair. First time shifting 125 million years? She asked. Yeah, he said, leaning forward. It takes getting used to, she said. Can I get you anything? Agent Sprucewood, was it? Agent Sprucewood shook her head. I'm fine. We can get started while Agent Kern recovers, can't we? Agent Sprucewood took a step toward the computer. I see you've started the decontamination program. Excellent. Have you determined why the automatic lockdown system didn't initiate? Not yet. Both the hardware and software are working perfectly. Sabotage? Tanima looked confused. No, there's no evidence of sabotage. Very well. What's next? I've completed the base-wide scans. Next is the hard part, I'm afraid. If you're ready, follow me. I'm coming too, Agent Kern said as he staggered out of the chair. The sooner I can get out of this suit, the better, he puffed as he caught up to them. Tanima opened cabinets, standing outside the airlock, and handed a black device to each of them. It looked like a squash racket, but thicker. The decontamination program has conducted 3 automated sweeps of the base. Now we have to go over the entire facility by hand, using these scanners to identify and eliminate microbes not recognized in the TPC database. She held up the scanner and waved it in front of the airlock door. There was a series of short beeps, and she pushed a button on the handle. Light flashed, reflecting violet. The scanner emitted a long beep. The door is clean, Tanima said. Any questions? The agents shook their heads. Satisfied they understood the task, Tanima assigned them to sections of the facility. Within moments, Agent Kern headed for the kitchen, Agent Sprucewood for the living quarters, and Tanima scanned the laboratory and computer room. It took 2 hours. Tanima was anxious, torn by the need to be as thorough as possible, and the desire to get the work completed so they could search for Shang. But it was imperative that the decontamination be completed first. Proceeding to the final stage, the digitized voice said as they crowded around the computer console. Emergency decontamination complete. Agent Kern expelled a long breath. Now what? Now we find Dr. Lamond, Agent Sprucewood answered. We brought a topographical map of a 5-mile radius around the facility. She stepped forward and tapped the computer screen. We've overlain the map with a search grid, using the facility as the center point. She pointed to lines dividing the area around the laboratory into pie pieces. Excluding the area outside the range of the external video and infrared scans, we can reasonably search 4 segments per outing. Protocol requires we go out in 2s, leaving 1 person here to coordinate. Where would you suggest we start, Dr. Nilsson? Tanima was taken aback. This was her base. She knew the situation and the lay of the land better than anyone. She should be in charge of the search. I think we should start at the nesting site, she said stiffly, pointing a finger to an area on the map. This is where we spent most of our time outside the facility. Without the homing beacon, he could not find his way back, and he may have looked for shelter in that area. Is there anything we can do to give Dr. Lamond a signal, something to guide him to the base? Agent Kern asked. Tanima frowned. No. The airlock is designed to be completely camouflaged. All transmissions and emissions, sound, light, even heat, are blocked. The only way would be to turn off the hologram, which would trigger another alert and automatically send an emergency message to TPC headquarters. There's no way to block that function. It simply wasn't designed for this situation. Agent Sprucewood nodded, as if she already knew the answer to Richard's question. Dr. Nilsson, if you're up to it, I think you should lead the first 2 outings. You know the territory. Agent Kern, you will accompany Dr. Nilsson. She winked at him. Then you can stay here, out of the biosuit for a while. It will be dark soon, Tanima said. We'll only be able to do 1 outing today. It's not safe to be out of the facility after nightfall. And Dr. Lamond? What about his safety? Agent Sprucewood's question was harsh. Tanima shook her head, near tears again. You don't understand. It's mission protocol to remain in the base after dark. This is the Cretaceous period. There are predators out there you've never imagined, as well as hazards and obstacles which are treacherous in the dark, even with best technology we have. We can't afford to lose more people, Agent Kern added gently. Look, I don't like this any more than you, Tanima continued. Dr. Lamond may be your mission, but he's my colleague. And my friend. Very well, Agent Sprucewood conceded. I'll get suited up, Tanima said with a grateful smile at Agent Kern. Once they were alone, Richard moved close to Rose and switched his radio to a private frequency. I know that tone of voice, he said. What are you thinking? I'm thinking Dr. Nilsson has spent all her time since the breach engaged in decontamination procedures, Rose answered. Which means she hasn't had time to clean up anything amiss. Richard sighed. You want to stay behind to search the base. Just a few more hours until you can get out of the biosuit, Rose answered with a smile. Rose didn't remove her biosuit until after Richard and Dr. Nilsson left, Richard carrying Dr. Lamond's biosuit in a backpack. Rose hung hers on a hook in the now empty alcove next to the airlock door. She headed directly to the laboratory. It was neat and organized as she'd expected it to be. Nothing looked out of place, nothing hastily abandoned or put away sloppily. She would have to snoop. She didn't have to search long, though. A soil sample container with a small amount of what looked like egg whites was sitting on an almost empty shelf of the laboratory's refrigeration unit. Bingo, Rose said to herself. Rose, this is Richard, come in, his voice crackled over her earpiece. Sprucewood here, Rose responded. It's an open communications channel, not a telephone call, she thought. We've located Dr. Lamond's footprints in the mud near a lake not far from the base, Richard said. Rose activated the lab monitor and accessed the video feed from the biosuits. Any sign of Dr. Lamond? Not yet. Dr. Nilsson says there are caves on the other side of the lake, he answered. The area is volcanic, and it's unlikely he sheltered there, but we'll check it out anyway to be sure. We'll report if we find anything. Very good, Agent Kern, Rose said. Sprucewood out. Richard shook his head. Sometimes Rose took the whole by-the-book thing a little too literally. Dr. Nilsson, you know your way around here better than I do. Would you like to take the lead? Thank you, Agent Kern, Tanima said. Please call me Richard, he said. In that case, watch your step, Richard. It gets muddy here. And call me Tanima. Will do, Tanima, Richard grinned. When he'd first stepped out of the airlock, he couldn't stop swinging his head to look at everything around him. The forest was both ordinary and strange at the same time. The sun and the blue sky were what he'd always known. Even the mouse-sized creature that looked like a possum was familiar. Aomaya, Tanima had called it. But as he looked up, a flying animal soared above him, with wings like any bird in his world, and a long split tail flashing color. Its head and beak were sharp and predatory. It was recognizable and completely alien. "It's called Chongchongornis," Tanima said. "Its tail is so long. It's beautiful." Richard breathed. "I've never seen anything like it." "I would be surprised if you had," she said, stepping around a large rock. "It went extinct 65 million years ago." Tanima halted, standing completely still. He followed her lead as an animal came out from behind a deep green conifer. Richard caught his breath. It was two-legged, leaning forward with upper limbs that looked like a cross between arms and wings, and covered with what Richard would have called feathery fur or furry feathers. It was unmistakably a dinosaur. "Bapiosaurus," Tanima whispered. Over 2 meters tall, it was running as if being chased, but they saw nothing pursuing it. It was so big, Richard breathed, once it had disappeared around the mineral lake. "It's not the biggest out here," Tanima responded to Richard's dismay. "I wonder what it was running from. They will sometimes raid Sinornithosaurus nests, but I've never seen one run from them." Now they were making good time edging their way around the lake, Richard being sure to place his feet in Tanima's footprints. The sensors in the biosuit told him of noises all around them, small animal rustling, the small plop sounds of fish surfacing on the lake, the breeze ruffling the cycad fronds and rippling the horsedale grasses. But as their search progressed, Richard didn't see anything bigger than the Bapiosaurus. There were many living things around, more than enough to satisfy his curiosity without triggering his adrenaline. Even though the heads-up display in the biosuit helmet labeled everything he looked at, Tanima gladly identified the animals for him. "Calabotrachus," she'd said when he pointed out a frog-like creature sitting in the shallows just below the lake's surface. They stopped to watch a huge pterosaur spear a fish with a narrow beak and dangerously jagged teeth. "Phylongus," she said, her eyes sparkling at his evident awe. "Wow," was all he could say. On the far side of the lake, steam rose from the ground, and behind that small hills, jumbled and jagged, rose darkly. "Take care," Tanima advised. "The ground is unstable." "Unstable how?" Richard came to a halt. "Have you ever seen the area around the geysers in Yellowstone? Or near Midge Lake in Iceland? It's like that. Break through the crust and you risk falling into boiling water or worse." Richard stepped gingerly. The steam puffed and blew, almost obscuring Tanima from sight. He imagined he could smell sulfur and fought a psychosomatic urge to cough. The steam parted, and Tanima stood before him with her right arm raised, shining the suit's flashlight into the dark of the caves. The caves were low and shallow, the flashlight reflected off the back walls. He saw no movement or evidence of Dr. Lamond in any of them. "I don't see him," he said. "Me neither," Tanima answered. She looked down at the ashy dirt in front of the caves. "And there are no footprints. I don't think he's been here." The sun was descending into the west when they gave up the search for the day. "Rose, this is Richard." "Go ahead." "We've seen no other sign of Dr. Lamond since finding the footprints by the lake." Tanima was right. He didn't take shelter in the caves. "It's getting late, and we're heading back. We'll reach the base by sundown," he said. Tanima, her shoulders slumped, nodded in agreement. The clear day had clouded in the afternoon, and the sunset painted the sky with fire. The mineral lake was bright with color, and Richard stopped to take in the splendor. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Tanima said, turning toward him. Her face glowed in the light, and Richard had the absurd desire to see it without the biosuit helmet, hair shining in the setting sun, framed by the vivid green of the conifers and cycads, and the enormous dinosaur that emerged from the trees behind her. Chapter 5. Tanima had not lied. This animal was huge, much larger than the Bapia whatever they had seen before. It was a good 7 meters long, over 3 times as tall as Richard, when it extended its neck upwards to examine the area around the lake. It had a peculiar bulged snout colored vivid orange and long forearms, each ending in a lethal-looking spiked thumb. Tanima must have seen his eyes widen and mouth gape, because she turned around to look behind her. Then she carefully retraced her steps back to Richard. "It's all right, Richard," she said in a soothing voice. "It's an Alturinus. An herbivore, harmless to us unless we get too close." "What happens if we get too close?" Richard asked as they gave the Alturinus a wide berth. "We could get stepped on, knocked into a tree, pushed over," Tanima shrugged. "They're only dangerous when they're frightened, and if we get in the way. Not to worry, we don't frighten them." "I don't want to see what does," Richard muttered as they returned to the base. As hard as he tried, Richard could not see the airlock behind the holographic projection that hid the base. The beacon told them they were heading right toward it, but no shimmer or wavering image gave away its location. "That's amazing," he muttered. "It really is," Tanima agreed. "You get used to it, but when you stop and think about it, you can't help but admit the technology is extraordinary." "What made you decide to put the base here?" "It was a long process," she answered as she ducked under a cycad frond. "Shang and I, along with other paleoscientists, scouted the area in observation mode for several seasons." "Of course," Richard nodded. "Observation mode would allow you to watch without interacting with the time frame." "Yes," she answered. "We wanted to find a place that wasn't a seasonal nesting spot or regular animal crossing, someplace safe to locate the base, and where its presence wouldn't impact the animals. But the base is so large, they must find it somehow. Running into it or something." She laughed, though not unkindly. "The base is underground. The only part of it on the surface is the airlock elevator, and only when we're outside. It's small enough that the chances of an animal running into it during those short periods are negligible. And the windows in the base are computer screens projecting a view of the outside," Richard said with dawning understanding. "Exactly," Tanima grinned. Richard wanted to ask what happened to the displaced Earth dug out for the base, but they had arrived at the airlock and Tanima was talking him through the decontamination process. He was glad to remove the biosuit. Perspiration had gathered on Richard's forehead and neck despite the recirculating air, and neither he nor the suit smelled very good. The suit's oxygen required recharging, its moisture and carbon dioxide caches replaced, and the biological waste emptied. As he broke down the suit into its constituent parts for automatic restoration, he was grateful he didn't join the Space Force. "Agent Kern, report," Rose's voice echoed in the airlock. "Completing decontamination now," Richard answered tiredly. "No sign of Dr. Lamond. We'll give you a full report when we exit decontamination." "Understood," Rose said as she closed the channel. Tanima waited for him in the decontamination chamber, ready to walk him through the next steps before they could re-enter the base. "Is Agent Sprucewood always so?" Tanima started as she initiated the UV cycle. "Yes, she is," Richard laughed. "And more so for this mission in particular. But don't get me wrong," he added. "She's one of the finest agents in the TPC. And one of the best friends I've ever had." "Why for this mission in particular?" Tanima asked as cool light filled the space. "This is her last mission," Richard said. "She's resigning from the TPC to marry a man she met in the 20th century. He chuckled. "She wants to finish her by-the-book career with a perfect record." Tanima looked at the floor. "I can understand that," she murmured. The UV decontamination cycle finished, and the airlock door opened. Rose stood in the hallway with one hand on her hip. "Technically, it's not my last mission," Rose said. "I'll make one more shift to confirm my retiring to the 20th century will not impact the timeline." "Of course," Richard said with a smirk and a small bow. "Ah," Congratulations on your upcoming marriage, Tanima said. Thank you, Rose said with an Agent Berg-like stare at Tanima. Tanima shifted to the left, as if trying to hide behind Richard. Is anyone hungry? I'm starving, Richard said to break the tension. What's there to eat? There's a wide selection in the kitchen, Tanima answered. We started the mission with 6 weeks' worth of food and, well, we won't be needing it all now. Please help yourself to whatever you want. I think I'll shower first. Richard opened his mouth as if to say he wanted a shower too, but the look on Rose's face silenced him. She followed him into the kitchen and sat at a table, watching him rummage through the food supplies until he found something appetizing. He knew that look. It was a combination of I was right and I disapprove. He had a good idea of what she was right about, and a guess about what she disapproved. Okay, out with it, he said, as he set a steaming plate of broccoli chicken on the table. What did you find? They already collected the gel sample, she answered. So you were right. He hid his sigh well. He was glad he wouldn't hear about the unprofessional chatter while they searched for Dr. Lamond, but his heart sank at the suggestion that Tanima had violated mission protocol. Anything else? He asked, digging into the broccoli. I reviewed the video footage from the last time they left the base. There's a gap in the record. One moment they're collecting data, the next they are walking back to the base. I think they erased the footage of when they took the gel. Are you going to confront Tanima? Or will you let the TPC Sciences Department handle it? We have to confront Dr. Nilsson, Rose said. Confront me about what? A voice over Rose's shoulder said. Tanima stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her hair still wet from her shower. About taking a sample of the Sinornithosaurus gel, Rose answered, without turning to look at Tanima. Is it true? Richard asked. Did you take an unauthorized sample? What are you talking about? Rose led the way to the lab and opened the refrigerator door, gesturing toward the container on the top shelf. Oh no, Tanima breathed as she removed the soil sample container and held it up. Sean, what did you do? You didn't know about this? No, I didn't, Tanima replied. My priority was photosynthesis research. You know plants. I never even got close to the nest. How could he have done this without you knowing? I had my back to him most of the time. He did his thing, I did mine, Tanima said. Wait, the video feed? Yes. The video feed cut out just as we were finishing yesterday. I thought it was a malfunction. Tanima looked stricken. Why didn't Dr. Lamond wait until he received authorization? Rose demanded. I don't know. Rose snorted. What's so special about this stuff? Richard asked. The mother Sinornithosaurus secretes a gel to cover her eggs, Tanima began. Shang thought it might be like albumin in chicken and other eggs, a source of nutrients, but delivered in a way we've not encountered before. It could hold the key to important medical advancements. More important than following protocol. Rose said sourly. Could the breach in protocol cause Dr. Lamond to leave the base? Richard asked. I don't think so, Tanima shook her head. What do you think made him leave the base? Rose asked. I honestly don't know. He seemed fine when I went to bed. She closed her eyes, remembering. He was distracted, focused on his request for authorization. But nothing really out of the ordinary. Did you and Shang have any personal issues? Rose asked, raising her eyebrows. Richard made a tisk sound, but didn't say anything. Personal issues? I'm not sure what you mean, Tanima started, and then understanding crossed her face. Her eyes grew small and hard. No, nothing like that. He was my colleague, a respected colleague and friend. Nothing more. We had to ask, you understand, Richard said, taking a step toward Tanima, his eyes kind. Yeah, sure, I get it, Tanima said, but she didn't smile in return. Will Dr. Lamone survive the night outside the base? Rose's tone remained sharp. Richard closed his eyes in frustration. Fortunately, the direct question did not appear to bother Tanima. So long as he doesn't encounter a predator, yes, he should be able to survive. There's plenty of good water, and as it's summer now, the overnight temperatures are mild. In fact, the weather forecast suggests it will be a lot warmer tomorrow. What about food sources? Richard asked. There's very little he can eat, I'm afraid. The human body can survive several days without food, so he should not be in any immediate danger of starvation, Rose said. Tanima's eyes flashed and her face grew dark. Did Dr. Lamone get a chance to analyze the sample? Richard asked. If he was wrong about the gel, if he discovered he violated protocol for no reason, that might have been why he left the base, he added as Rose frowned. Tanima accessed the computer. Yes, it looks like he did, she said. And what were the results? Rose asked. Her caustic tone was easing up, Richard noted with relief. Tanima leaned forward, shaking her head. This is odd, she said. The spectrometer analysis is completely different from what I'd expect. She looked at the container she'd set on the desk next to her. There's only a small amount of the gel, barely enough to run a single series of analyses. See here? She pointed to what looked to Richard like colored dashes across dark lines. He was wrong, Tanima said in a low voice. The gel doesn't provide nutrients. There are a few proteins which would be expected in an albumin-like substance, but it's primarily composed of enzymatic peptides. She paused. It's a biological toxin. A toxin? Rose said. A mechanism to defend the eggs, it has to be, Tanima said. Anything that steals the eggs from the nest gets more than they bargained for. The Bay Apisaurus, Richard muttered, remembering the running dinosaur. Yes. That explains why Mom is comfortable leaving the nest for so long, and why her nest is so generously decorated with her own feathers, she nodded. They must act as a warning, as well as insulation. But how are the young not poisoned by it? Richard asked. I don't know, she answered. Maybe they have a natural immunity. Maybe the toxin dissipates before hatching occurs. It's something we need to find out. No, what we need to find is Dr. Lamone, Rose said, cutting them off. In case you've forgotten. Tanima stepped away from the computer station. No, I've not forgotten. Her voice was cold, but her eyes blazed. If there's nothing else, it's been a trying day and I need rest. Excuse me, she said as she left the laboratory. This mission would go more smoothly if you didn't keep antagonizing her, Richard murmured. Rose narrowed her eyes. Holding her accountable is not antagonizing her. But she said she had nothing to do with it, Richard protested. Perhaps. But it's too much of a coincidence that Dr. Lamone opened the base to contamination right after violating protocol, she said. And I don't believe in coincidences. So you're saying she's in league with him or something? I'm saying we need to keep our eyes open. Right. Chestnut Coven stuff. Be on the lookout for boogeymen. Ooh, he waved his fingers in front of her. The joke fell flat. Rose cocked her head at him, her face unreadable. I'm sorry. I'm tired too, he said. I'm heading to bed. He walked away, leaving Rose alone in the lab. One by one, the lights in the base dimmed and extinguished as automated systems registered nightfall outside and the reduced movement inside. While Tanima and Shang each had private quarters, Richard and Rose shared a room with 4 bunk beds along 2 walls, rudimentary lodging for temporary visitors. Richard took a lower bunk away from the door. He expected he would lie awake, staring at the bunk above, going over the weirdest day of his life. He remembered the Cretaceous sunset and Tanima's face, and closed his eyes. He opened his eyes. Someone was screaming. A woman. A woman was screaming in terror.